Okay, so the case that I chose was Tinker v. Des Moines, and I'm gonna have to turn my camera on different spots so we can see a little bit better here. So before I get into the actual case, the question that I kind of want us to be thinking about here, how are we as teachers and school districts supposed to be able to prove if something substantially interferes with school operations? And that's going to be a really important term that is used in this particular case, because that is open for a very, very broad interpretation. One administrator might think that something substantially interferes with school operations, and another may not. So, who exactly is to say what impedes a school operation? I mean, for every single instance that we have, we can't take a case to the Supreme Court. This is obviously a very foundational case that we're looking at here, but it's not realistic to be sued or sue for every single case. So how do we take something so subjective and turn it into something more usable and efficient? I guess that's my overarching question. So again, before we get into the case, we need to talk about what exactly the First Amendment is. And it's very wordy and, of course, a little bit difficult to understand. But Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So, long story short, basically this says you will not persecute based on religion. You will not allow or disallow someone from what they say, their freedoms of speech. You cannot stop people from grouping together, assembling together, meaning like protesting. And people are allowed to petition their government for any issues that they are having. Now, obviously, we are in a much different day and age than when our founding fathers made the Constitution. There is no doubt. But keeping in mind that we attempt to, even with our changing lifestyles and laws, even attempt to still abide by the initial wording of our Constitution. So, moving into the actual case, here's our context. So, oops, sorry, let me go back. In 1965, there were a group of students who were planning on protesting the Vietnam War by wearing black armbands to show that they were supporting a truce in the Vietnam War and bringing our soldiers home. Their plan was to do it over a holiday break into the new year, and they were going to wear them to school. Somehow, the administrators of the school district found out that this was going to occur, and they made a ban on these armbands in such attire, and if they did so anyway, they would be suspended. So a couple of students, Mary Beth Tinker and another student by the name of Christopher, and subsequently her brother, John Tinker, did the same thing the next day, wore the armbands anyway, and they were sent home and suspended. So after this happened with their parents, those students decided to sue the school district for violating their student right to express themselves. Specifically, and I'll get into more detail in a couple of slides here, but the Supreme Court ended up ruling with Tinker, and they struck down the ban, saying that the school had to provide and prove that the conduct of speech either materially and substantially is interfering with school operations in order to justify the ban. So, tying back into the question at the very beginning, it's difficult to say what materially and substantially interferes with school operations. In this particular case, the Supreme Court ruled with students. the different arguments here. For the students and their parents, they were challenging the ban being a violation of the free speech clause of the First Amendment, saying that they were not being allowed to express themselves fully and unfairly being disciplined. So initially what the lawsuit was about was they wanted an injunction that prevented the school from punishing them for doing so. While the school district, on the other hand, upheld that they had every right to ban those specific armbands, and it was made a part of their school dress code. And they had the right to discipline as necessary to ensure that other protests and whatnot were not happening in their school district. However, when it initially went to the district court, it was dismissed, and they ruled that the school district had acted reasonably to ensure discipline in their school, and they had every right to do so. However, through many appeals, the case ended up going to the Supreme Court, and like I said, later ended up ruling with the students, which is Tinker in this case, and one of the closing arguments were that students do not shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gates, meaning that even though they're at school and rules, generally speaking, must be followed, that doesn't mean that they can be told that they can't express themselves, that they can't say certain things, X, Y, and Z. So kind of like what I was talking about at the beginning, my general analysis, as time goes on, our circumstances are going to continue changing. Back then they didn't have online website. Times have changed, but the Constitution generally, aside from very specific amendments, does not. We are interpreting specific cases as much as we can, but overall, especially with First Amendment cases, which can be very, very sticky, we cannot oppress freedom of speech, religion, or expression, which in this particular case, the Supreme Court ruled that that was happening and that the kids were not doing it. They weren't hurting anybody. They weren't interrupting classes. They weren't pushing themselves on anybody. They were just simply wearing armbands to express something that they believed in. And personally, I agree with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that as long as they are not forcibly trying to pressure people into, what they believe and they're not disrupting anything, then I think that is okay. However, First Amendment rights get sticky. There's no doubt. As far as lessons learned, so I have a little bit of a story that goes with this here. So last year, at my district. And this is where the subjectivity of things gets difficult, because I think legality is very subjective, and the terminology of the Constitution is incredibly specific, but also very, very broad. So schools are put into the position where they have to be mindful of not violating anybody's rights while still being able to maintain control and discipline of their district. So how are we supposed to keep up with that? It's very difficult. And my dad, he's a retired history teacher and taught for many, many years. And he said, well, you kind of just have to keep in the back of your mind that you're trying to do what's right. Okay, well, what's right? What's right to me might not feel right to a student, to a parent, to an administrator. Like it's not nearly as cut and dry as I wish it were. And so last year at our district, and it turned out that there was a lot of underlying issues at home and everything, but there was a young woman who, which I didn't know this was a thing, but identified as a furry, which means that you identify or act like an animal. And she took it a bit extreme and asked the administration if she could use our long jump pits, which for those of you who are not athletically inclined are sand pits that people jump into for track and field, as a bathroom, as a litter box. outside instead of the public bathrooms. And she was denied. And so she took it a step further, and she was wearing cat ears, like Halloween cat ears, and like a collar on her neck, and that was fine and everything. But then she came to school wearing nothing but a fur coat, like a fur coat and nothing underneath. And so they called a meeting with the parents and everything, and came to an agreement that that was distracting and disruptive, and it turned into this big thing where people started to bully her. Like in PE, she would still wear the cat tail and the ears and everything, which they allowed. She had to still change out with shorts and a t-shirt, but the kids in her class would start barking or chasing her up trees, like chasing her up into the bleachers and barking at her, pretending that she was a cat. Like it was starting to actually change the dynamic of classes. And honestly, I was not privy to a lot of those meetings because she was a senior and I teach middle schoolers. But it became a really, really large issue. And she ended up leaving the district of her own accord. But my point here with this story is, what would have happened if the parents and that student decided to sue because they told her no to a litter box and told her that she had to wear more than a fur coat? At what point is that behavior and expression, if you will, an issue, like it says in the Supreme Court case? Like, is that changing the dynamic of school operations? I would say yes. If PE classes are being disrupted because they're barking her up bleachers, now we have a problem. Now it's disrupting the day-to-day operations. But do we, I mean, it's just really complicated. Do we tell her that she has to act like a human, that she doesn't get to express herself altogether? I don't know. I don't pretend to have all of the answers, but cases like that are becoming more and more common. And I just wonder, like, we can't go to court every single time a case like that shows up. So how do we keep up with the subjectivity of these First Amendment rights, is my general question.